We're excited to welcome Nichole here for the webinar series. Nichole's an aquatic invasive species program specialist with the Great Lakes Commission and also has ties back to the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, where she did the work that she'll be talking about today. The title of Nichole's presentation is Aquatic Invasive Species Prevention, Getting the Best Bang for the Buck. And Nichole, I will turn it over to you to take it from here.
Thanks for the introduction, Megan. I'm going to be discussing, like she said, some of my master's research that I did at the University of Minnesota. So a lot of it will be Minnesota-centric, but I think widely applicable to other regions as well. But I'm excited to talk to you about the cost effectiveness of various AIS preventions for mitigating spread via the boater mediated pathway. So to get right into it, I'm going to give a little bit of background just because I know a lot of you here are really familiar with AIS and AIS issues, but I'm going to reiterate why we should care about AIS issues. Maybe you're new to the field or something like that. But the reality is we're all impacted by AIS in some way, shape, or form, whether maybe you're a boater and you deal with zebra mussels getting stuck on your boat, or maybe you're an angler that deals with spiny water flea getting stuck on your fishing line or clogging up your fishing reels. Maybe you're an unconventional water recreationalist like a seaplane pilot that deals with macrophytes getting stuck on rudders and floats and being transported to really pristine and vulnerable locations. But this last one I think we can all really resonate with is maybe you're a researcher or a biologist that has to go through some pretty stringent permitting and protocol processes and decontaminating equipment, all these things that are really great for preventing spread, but can sometimes put setbacks on research. So the reality is everyone's impacted. And on top of this, there's a lot of money being poured into AIS issues. We have state funds going in, we have county funds going in, we have, local funds from lake associations, watershed districts, and this doesn't even account for the federal funds as well. So we have this really complex and multifaceted issue moving through the human system. And this is what makes AIS management really, really difficult. I'm sure a lot of you can resonate with this, but take, for example, this manager that has to decide between implementing prevention to stop invaders from getting there, or control of the invasives that are already present, or maybe monitoring for seeing what's knocking on their doorstep. A lot of managers have to decide which path or couple paths to go on, and they have to do this all with limited funds. You can't do everything, but this is what makes invasive species management really difficult. But what we do know right now is that prevention is the most cost-effective form of intervention. And we do have really great examples of prevention being successful. Take, for example, this news line from, I think it was 2022, where a watercraft inspector stopped starry stonewort from being introduced into Lake Superior. They found a tiny little bullbill on the motor of the watercraft. They removed it, did a decontamination, and prevented a really serious or risky threat to a lake that provides a lot for us. So we do have examples of prevention working really successfully, and this is why the state and other entities continually pour money into AIS prevention. So that's kind of where we're going to be a preface of why we should study AIS prevention and why I did for my master's research. So getting into it, what do we know about AIS prevention already? So I don't want to discount all the research that's already been done concerning AIS prevention. We know what temperatures are needed to kill certain invasives with decontamination. We know where secondary spread is likely to happen based on, environmental suitability and all sorts of things. And we have an idea of, what type of educational campaigns are working and not, and all sorts of things. These studies have been instrumental in developing standardized protocols for inspection and decontamination across the nation. However, they really focus on prevention efficacy. So they focus on how these preventions are being done, maybe in the lab or with research personnel. And I wanted to take these a step further with my research to understand, how are these preventions being done in the field with the folks that are actually doing them. So we wanted to focus on prevention effectiveness for this. So getting into it, I know I mentioned that we did this research mostly in Minnesota, so that's where we're going to focus. And we wanted to understand how effective were the most commonly used AIS preventions in the state of Minnesota. And those were boater education, watercraft inspection, and hot water decontamination. And just for some background, boater education is a process of teaching boaters best management practices like cleaning and drying and draining their boats through, signs at boat launches or educational events and things like that. Watercraft inspection is the process of having a trained and usually a paid watercraft inspector sitting at a launch and intercepting boats that are launching or coming out of the launch. And they intercept those boats and visually look for AIS and remove any that they find on the boat. And then hot water decontamination is a process completed after inspection where a trained decontaminator will utilize a unit that sprays hot water and high pressure on the boat to both kill and remove an AIS that may be stuck on the boat or can't be seen with the naked eye. So these are the preventions we're going to focus on for the rest of this talk. And like I said, we wanted to focus on prevention effectiveness. And to do this, we decided to host experimental boat inspections, or what we're calling experimental boat inspections. So here's a high-level overview of what those inspections entailed. But basically, we traveled to boat launches across the state, recruiting boaters, inspectors, and decontaminators to inspect and remove AIS from a boat that we had purposely planted or contaminated with aquatic invasive species. So we had this boat, went around the state, contaminated it, and said, hey, do what you would normally do if this were your boat, if they were a boater, or if this were any boat going through the launch that day, if they were an inspector or a decontaminator. So the first step in doing these experimental boat inspections was deciding how to actually spike the boat. So we chose 10 standardized species and locations based on, we chose 3 species, 10 locations, based upon the expert opinion and the literature on where AIS are known to get stuck on a typical fishing boat and what AIS are known to get stuck. So we put plants in 6 locations, zebra mussels in 2, spiny water flea in 1, and residual water in another. And all of these species and locations were standardized, so all participants saw the same species spiked in the same locations. So if you want to, or if you're a more visual person and you want to see how we actually spiked these things on the boat, these are actual images of what the boat looked like. This was a boat that we used for these experimental inspections. And I did want to note that we used, dead or surrogate AIS for this. So you might notice that the plant hanging off the boat is coontail, which is a native plant to Minnesota, meant to mimic, Eurasian water milfoil or another kind of draping plant. And then we use preserved spiny water fleas and dried out zebra mussel shells, and then residual water just from the lake or wherever we were at that day. All right, so when we decided how to spike the boat, this is what we did. Then we had to decide, who are we going to recruit and how are we going to recruit them to complete these experimental inspections. And we wanted our participants to represent the preventions in question. So we decided to recruit boaters to represent the effectiveness of boater education programs, inspectors for the effectiveness of watercraft inspection programs, and subsequently decontaminators for the effectiveness of hot water decontamination. So then we had to decide how to actually evaluate those participants. Once they agreed to partake in the research, we then read them a standardized script and scenario to give them an idea of the situation that the boat had been in, that it had been in an infested water. And they should do what they would normally do, knowing that it had the potential to host AIS. So once a participant started their inspection process, we had 2 evaluators observing that process and recording certain things about their removal. The first evaluator recorded what they had removed of what we had placed on the boat, and the second recorded where they were looking and touching on the boat, even if we hadn't placed something there. So obviously we couldn't put AIS in every single location, or else you just have a boat caked with invasives, and that's pretty unrealistic. So we tried to account for that with our second evaluators recording those information. So I know some of you might be thinking, Nichole, you're sitting there watching someone do an inspection? Don't you think that's going to cause them to try harder or do better? And we do realize this sort of an inherent bias. However, even when we were watching them complete their inspection, they didn't remove everything that we had placed on the boat. So we're really treating this data as kind of the best case scenario for removal, or the baseline data for the best case scenario. So this type of evaluation where we were visually observing these participants worked great for the hand removal process completed by all 3 levels of participants. However, when we got to the hot water decontamination portion of the inspection, we had to, change gears and figure out how are we going to figure out how effective that hot water spray being applied to the boat is. So we asked the decontaminators to get out their lava guns and spray lava on the boat. I'm just kidding. We used a thermal imager to record the temperature and duration of water being sprayed on the boat and compared that to the UMPS protocol, which is a 60°C spray for 10 seconds needed to kill 100% of adult zebra mussels. And we do realize that there may be lower temperatures and times needed to kill other invasive species that aren't as tolerant as zebra mussels, but we just wanted to keep it standard, so we went with the UMPS protocol. And we sectioned out the boat, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, and we recorded the longest temperature and duration being sprayed on each section to then be able to quantify a decontamination as a whole. So after we evaluated both the inspectors and the decontaminators, we gave them a questionnaire to fill out just via Qualtrics on a tablet at the launch. And it asked them questions to kind of hint at what their education, backgrounds, or beliefs about AIS are. So then we could correlate those answers with how well they did with their removal process. And I won't get into the results from this questionnaire, but they do exist, and I'm happy to share those results with you and talk with you if you're interested. Just shoot me an email after this and we can chat. All right, so let's get into some fun stuff. What did we find with these experimental inspection processes? So the map here is showing all the different locations that we collected information from, and we divided the participants out into the metro and outstate areas, with metro in red and the outstate areas in blue. So we tried to get a representative sample from both different regions, which you can see in the tables on the left-hand side of the screen. But we collected information from 144 participants across the state within 15 different counties and 57 different boat launches. And we went to a lot more boat launches than that too, just didn't get information from those folks. So we did a lot of traveling for this project. You might be thinking like, why is there none in the southwestern portions of Minnesota? And that's because there's a lot of farmland there and not a lot of lakes. So we tried to, maximize how many people we could get for where we went. So we stuck with those places that had a lot of lakes. So this is where we went and how much information we got. So let's go over what we found with these inspections. So I'm going to go over some raw numbers here, and then we'll go through the details after that. So what did we find? We found that boaters were around 56% effective at removing AIS from the boat that we had planted with AIS. Inspectors were around 79%, and then decontaminators were around 84% effective. So we also, while we see these raw numbers, we saw differences by participant type. So the inspectors and decontaminators were a little bit better at removing AIS than were the boaters. And this makes sense. Inspectors are trained and paid to be there doing that job. And while boaters were less effective than the trained folks, I do want to say that boaters were by no means ineffective. 56% is a lot better than 0, especially when we can't place, inspectors at every single launch throughout the state. So we saw removal differences by participant type. We also saw removal differences by region. So first diving into the boaters, we saw that boaters in the metro area were a little bit better at removing AIS than those in the outstate region. And I try to think about why this might happen. And I think about our education efforts in both of those regions. And as you get outstate, there's lakes that are fewer and far in between. You can't put signs everywhere. Whereas when you get in the metro area, there's a lot of people going to a few large lakes, and you can put a lot of education there. So I think those metro area boaters might be getting exposure to more educational things than some of those outstate boaters. All right, so moving on to the inspectors, we saw differences, but in the opposite direction. So the outstate inspectors were a little bit better at removing AIS than were the metro area inspectors. And the data shows that this is due to one specific type of invasive, and that was the spiny water flea. So for some regional background about Minnesota, spiny water flea currently exist in the outstate areas. They're in Superior and some inland lakes. However, the farthest south they go is Mille Lacs, which is about an hour and a half drive from the cities. So those outstate inspectors are very well aware of spiny water flea. They deal with them. They were looking for them, whereas in the metro area, not so much. So, that could be explaining those differences by region with the inspectors. All right. So we also saw differences by the type of invasive species. I'll pull more of this plot up in a minute, but we'll first just look at the 6 locations we put plants on the boat. You can see the intervention type or the participant type on the y-axis. So overall, all participants did really, really well with the plants, pretty good removal percentages. However, this differs when we look at other invasive species, specifically the zebra mussels on the motor mount was a difficult one for most participants. And then also the spiny water flea, and less so, but still present with that residual water in the bait bucket. So overall, plants were the easiest to see and remove, likely due to their like draping morphology. It's pretty intuitive that a large bunch of plants is easier to see than a small spiny water flea on the tip of the fishing rod, or a little zebra mussel shell in the crevice of a motor mount. So that could explain some of these trends that we're seeing here. All right. Just checking my time. Okay, we're good on time. So recall back to when I said that we looked at where folks were touching and looking on the boat, even if we hadn't placed something there. So these are the results from that. I'm going to show these plots to you in a minute, but I just want to say that these are the results from specifically the boaters. For the sake of time, I kept it to boaters. So with this, we saw that there were areas of success that boaters were really looking and touching closely. And these were the hull and the trailer on each side of the boat. And I think this kind of correlates with our education efforts in that we tell boaters to feel down near the hull for zebra or sandpaper like zebra mussels, and we tell folks to check your trailer for weeds. Those types of messages are really getting across to boaters. As you can see, the yellow and green bars count for a large percentage of boaters. So they were looking and touching at these locations. However, on the flip side, there were some areas of concern, and these were the floor, the lights and wiring, the motor mount, and the transducer. So shown by the red bars, we can see that around 40 to 50% of boaters simply overlook these locations, or maybe they didn't know to look at these locations. And then another 30 to 40% represented by the yellow bars just looked at these locations and didn't touch them. So these might be areas we want to focus on for future education and outreach efforts. Okay, recall back to the thermal imagery, lava-like thermal imagery that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to show you the results from that in a second. There's going to be a heat map overlaid on top of a boat, heat map per se, sort of my version of a heat map, I guess, what I could do with my limited Photoshop abilities. But just to orient you, there's going to be a scale here with darker colors represent a lower section sufficiency and lighter colors representing a higher section sufficiency. So what did we find with the thermal imagery data? And we saw that there was a lot of variability in the decontamination processes that were completed, and overall relatively low section sufficiency. But one thing we did note was that when you look at the underside of the hole on the upper right-hand side of this figure, it's a lot lighter than, say, the sides of the hole or the back of the hole. And this shows that decontaminators are focusing their efforts on the underside of the hull where those zebra mussels are likely to attach because they're below the water line on the boat. So overall, the section sufficiency wasn't like what we anticipated it being. And one reason for that is that we noticed that the decontamination units themselves actually sinuate in temperature where they'll kick on, they'll reach that threshold needed to kill 100% of adult zebra mussels, and then it'll kick off and reach, dip below that threshold. Then it'll kick on again and kick off. So really what we're noticing is that these decontamination units might not be doing exactly what we anticipate they are. These units are made for industrial cleaning and not really for like the exact specifics that hot water decontamination really needs. And I know the state of Minnesota is very well aware of this, and I know there's some things in the pipeline to try to develop some sort of better decontamination unit that will suit the specificities that hot water decontamination needs. And another thing I wanted to mention is that we did a few decontaminations with a stationary system where it was like a hot water boiler sitting in a shed that they used to decontaminate with, and that hot water boiler did actually stay up to temp like it was anticipated or doing. So these are just some things that I think about a lot with decontamination, and just I guess some things for you to all think about as you employ decontaminators and use different types of units. So I'm going to move on to talk about, I guess this is the last slide about the effectiveness of these inspection processes. And then we'll move on to talking about the costs. So we saw that as more time was spent on an inspection process, that generally the better someone did, which is kind of what we expected, up to a certain point at least, they did better with more time spent. And I think this could probably be incorporated also into future education things, saying, just telling boaters to slow down or telling inspectors to, take a second look around the boat, take your time with the inspection, and it might really, increase your removal percentage by a lot. So I really like this plot, and I think it's really simple, but I think we can really use it in ways that'll make big moves in the future. All right, so kind of flew through looking or talking about the effectiveness side of this project. But there's two pieces to the puzzle here. We have to think about cost and effectiveness, because like I said in the beginning, managers have to work on a budget. They don't have unlimited funds to spend on their prevention programs. So when thinking about the costs or how much money is being spent on AIS prevention in the state of Minnesota, we first wanted to get some background information about what's actually being spent and how is it being spent. So we reached out to the Minnesota DNR. I think Tina is actually on the call. So thanks, Tina. You were really helpful in providing some information for this study. We reached out to the DNR, and the DNR has they give money out to the counties every year to spend on AIS prevention. That money is given to counties based upon how many boat launches they have and how many trailer parking spaces are at those boat launches. And then so they give counties money to spend on their prevention program plans. And then in return, the counties can decide to voluntarily report what they spent that money on and what it kind of accomplished for them. So we, sifted through that data, and we tried to look for general spending trends. And we also got an idea of what counties were reporting with a high level of detail with few data gaps. And those are the counties we decided to reach out to host interviews with. And the purpose of these interviews was to gather, I guess, a finer grained data set of spending in Minnesota. So we asked for itemized cost categories from these different county managers. I'm sure there's a few county managers on the call here, so thank you to all of you that helped out. But you can see the itemized cost categories on the screen here, with education on the left-hand side and inspection and decontamination on the right-hand side. So we held these interviews gathering this type of information from 19 different counties. And I'm just going to go through an example from one county, and that is Cass County, which is located in north central Minnesota. So this is what Cass County reported to us that they spent their prevention money on. And then on top of how much they spent, we also wanted to understand how many interventions are they doing with this money. So we asked for just that, how many inspections and decontaminators and personnel are you hiring with these funds? And I wanted to highlight the number of boaters within the county. This number was not collected from county managers. This number was obtained from a boater network model created by a grad student that came before me, that basically forecasts where boaters are moving throughout the state using watercraft inspection data. If you're interested in learning about that, head to this paper right here. It has some great details, but I'm in no way a modeler and do not have the credentials to be explaining to you how that works. But feel free to check it out if you want. But that's just how we got the number of boaters in each county. So like I said, we collected this type of information from 19 different counties. And then we went ahead and averaged those costs to get the numbers that you see on the screen here. And we did the same for the number of interventions being done. And these two pieces of the puzzle are helpful for thinking about the cost per intervention. So cost as the numerator and number of interventions being done as the denominator to get this plot right here, which is cost per intervention. So just note that this is on a log scale. So there was extreme differences between the three different interventions in question, with a boater trip costing around 40 cents, an inspection around $20, and a decontamination costing around $362. And I know some of you might be thinking, that's a lot of money to spend on a decontamination, like a single decontamination. And it is, but it's representative because those decontamination units cost anywhere from $20,000 and up. And they require more training and safety protocols and winterization and all these different things. So that's why that number is pretty high. And while these numbers are black and white, literally on the screen here, there's a lot that goes into them. And, take, for example, if an inspector is at a busy launch on a Saturday and they do 20 inspections in a day versus, 5 on a slow Tuesday, like these costs per intervention values are going to change a little bit, but these are just general trends that we saw with that cost information that we collected from county managers. Okay, so now we're going to take a step back and think about these two pieces, cost and effectiveness, and where to go from here with these data. So we've collected, these great data from all over the state of Minnesota. What do we do with it now? So I'm going to introduce to you the AIS Explorer. If you guys haven't heard of it already, the AIS Explorer is an online dashboard that helps with prevention program planning. You can check it out if you'd like with that link on the screen. It is live right now. But I'll go through some of the tabs on this AIS Explorer and what it's capable of. So the first tab on the AIS Explorer is basically a tab that forecasts the spread of AIS within the state, based upon infestation status and where boaters are moving throughout the state. The second tab tells you where you should prioritize placing your watercraft inspectors based upon, again, infestation status at each lake and how many boaters that lake experiences. And then we're creating a new tab called Intervention Impact. This tab is basically a 5-stage process that allows managers to go in and kind of create a hypothetical prevention plan where they can go in, they can choose their county, they can choose their lake, and they can decide which of the 3 interventions that I mentioned they want to put at these different lakes. And then once they decide their interventions, they can decide how many boaters they want to intervene on with that prevention, which is defining effort. They can define how effective those preventions will be. They can decide how much they're going to cost. They can do all sorts of really great things. It's pretty user defined. And once you go through this 5-stage process, you'll get a summary table, which I'll show to you on the next slide. But just as some background, I wanted to explain that I am in no way, again, I'm in no way a modeler. I'm not an R-Shiny expert. I did not develop this AIS Explorer tool, but I can lead you to those who did, if you're interested in how it all works behind the scenes. My portion of this tool was defining default values for costs and effectiveness. So from that data that I explained to you earlier, the two different parts of this project, the cost and the effectiveness, we use those values as default values in this tool. So say a manager got to the effectiveness stage 3, defining effectiveness, and they said, I don't know how effective the boaters are in my county. And I wouldn't know either. That's a really difficult question. So managers can actually use the default effectiveness values that we found with those experimental boat inspections to allow them to finish through this 5-stage process and get a summary output that's applicable to them. So they can define effectiveness and cost themselves, or they can use default values that are already in there. So once this 5-stage process is done, a manager has made this intervention plan that's hypothetical and applied at different lakes throughout their county. They get a summary output that is a long HTML output that has all sorts of really great data. I'm just going to summarize a small portion of it, but basically the output tells them how much that intervention plan is going to cost in total and how much it costs per intervention, and also what the reduction in risk is going to be. So underlying the AIS Explorer, there's a model that helps understand how the boater network model that I mentioned earlier, it helps better understand how AIS are moving throughout the state. So we can tell managers how many infestations are expected to happen under the status quo scenario where no interventions are placed, and then also how many infestations are expected to happen under their intervention scenario. So it really allows them to see, what they're getting for what they're spending. And I'm just going to go through, again, a case study of Cass County to show you what this tool is really capable of. So let's say Cass County spends or has available to them $500,000 to spend on their prevention plan to mitigate zebra mussel infestations. So if they don't use any of that money, and they say, we're not applying interventions this year, they could expect around 60 new zebra mussel infestations over a 5-year period. And I just want to say that this in no way reflects Cass County. This is simply hypothetical. But that's what would happen under the status quo scenario. Let's say Cass County wanted to use their prevention money and they wanted to use it in this way, where they spend it 75% on inspections, 20 on decontamination, and 5 on boater education. So they go through that 5-stage process, and here's what they see. They reduced the number of infestations by a little bit. Let's say they think that's not good enough. They want to do something different, or maybe they don't have a decontamination unit, so they want to spend it a little bit differently, and they decide to split it 50-50 between inspections and boater education. So they can go through that process and see what that does for them, and that reduced by quite a bit. So they can so on and so forth. They can go through these different scenarios and see what that's gonna happen across the landscape. So let's say that Cass County also thought that their effectiveness value, so their prevention effectiveness, is different than the default effectiveness. Let's say that they didn't implement any boater education and they think their boaters aren't doing as well as the average boater. They can go in and they can change that effectiveness to be lower, and they can see what will happen with that. Similarly, they can change, maybe they think their hot water decontaminators are the best out there, 100% top notch. They can see what's going to happen. So really, this is just highlighting the applicability of this tool and what it can do for prevention planning in the long run. And yeah, so this is just an example of a case study of Cass County. This isn't, doesn't reflect Cass County. I just want to emphasize that. So, putting this all together, we've thought about effectiveness, we've thought about costs and how, it differs situationally, and there's some variability. But the AIS Explorer really helps managers deal with these complexities and prevention cost effectiveness. And I wanted to leave with a final statement that every prevention is extremely important. We didn't do this research to, say you shouldn't do one intervention over another. No, you should never implement one ever again, that sort of thing. Like, that was not the purpose of this research. Boater education is extremely important when inspectors and decontaminators can't be present at launches. Inspectors are a form of both, education and manual removal. Decontaminators are really important for those high-risk scenarios where there might be microscopic or stuck on AIS on a boat. So all in all, every single prevention is important. And this tool kind of highlights how you can use each prevention to the best of its abilities and get the best bang for the buck. So with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, Tim, Adam, Josh, Amy, Alex, Val, Ruben, and especially my master's advisor, Nick Phelps, and also our funders. And I'll leave you with a funny meme, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nichole. I've switched my audio back, so I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to take over share screen real quick.
Okay.
So that everyone can see the link. So again, we really appreciate you coming. That was just such a great presentation. I love the practical applications for the work that you did that you're sharing as well. So we're moving on to Q&A, and I can see people have already been active in Slido. Thank you for that. I have the code up again. So if you have questions for Nichole, you can enter them here. You can either scan the little QR code or just go to slido.com and enter that code prevent 2023. It'll take you in, so you can either enter your own questions, you can look at questions others have had and upvote those questions. And we'll work our way from the most popular questions down. So I'm going to start, Nichole, with a question. I'll leave the screen up for just a little bit longer, and then I'll shut it off so that you don't have to stare at a QR code the entire time. But we'll have the links in chat and everything for you as well. So Nichole, first question for you is, how much background was there for the participants, so the boaters, inspectors, decontaminators, prior to their inspection? So were they told that the boats had planted AIS on there? Were they asked specifically to inspect the boat? Like, what were the instructions given?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as we approached these participants, we said, hey, we're researchers with the university. We're looking to better understand how these preventions are working. So they knew we were researchers. They knew a little bit about what we were doing, and we let them know that we had a boat that we had been sitting in the water, just like I mentioned that scenario. We didn't explicitly say there was AIS on the boat, but we said it had been in an AIS infested water. So I bet some of them had some hypotheses as maybe there was some things on the boat because we were out here doing this, but all in all, it would be cool to do. I know there is some things in the work with, I think Ingrid Schneider and them at the University of Minnesota to look at doing like a secret boater type of thing where you kind of just observe people inspecting their own boats and that sort of thing. But, the folks that we approached knew that we were researchers, knew that the boat had the potential to harbor AIS, that sort of thing. But they didn't know that we didn't definitively say like there are AIS on this boat. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question was wondering if all the boats were outboard motors, had outboard motors.
Yeah, so we used the same, we had two boats that were extremely similar, almost the same, just two outboard motor, typical Lund fishing boats that we used. So it would be cool. I think it would be really awesome to do something with like a pontoon or something else that obviously requires a different type of inspection or more rigorous inspection. So overall, yeah, we did do only the typical Lund outboard motor fishing boat.
Great. Okay. So next question. As folks get more comfortable with the concept of decontamination, do we expect that the cost per decon would go down? And how do you think we can get folks to want to decon their equipment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first part of it is, do I think cost per decon is going to go down? My answer to that is no, unless we develop some sort of unit that costs less. Decontaminations are going to cost more relative no matter what, because they're still going to take the same amount of time. You know, a decontamination, we saw that they took anywhere from like, I think it was 22 minutes up to an hour for decontaminations, or no, it was 9. 22 is the average. It was 9 to up to an hour for a decontamination. So they're still going to take that same amount of time. So it's not like you can get through more decontaminations. So I think that cost is probably going to stay relatively the same unless we can develop some sort of unit that's a little cheaper to employ. What was the second part of that question again, Megan?
How do we think we can get folks to want to decon their equipment?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. The main reason that people don't want to decon their equipment, for some background, is that it takes too long and they're worried that it might scratch their very shiny and sparkly boat. So that's a really touchy question. I think as we continually work on education campaigns and things like that, and I say this not only referring to decontamination, but just accepting AIS as in general and AIS prevention steps, talking with the inspectors at the launches, a lot of them told me, like, 10 years ago, no one would even let me look at their boat, and now they're more than happy to have me look at it. So I think it's really just making these prevention steps a social norm, and having people be ready and willing and understanding of, what's at stake if they don't do these prevention steps. So it's kind of my run around that answer, but that's definitely a tough one for sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, could you explain more about the intervention process using boaters? Is this a process where a boater does their own inspection instead of by a trained or paid boat inspector?
So I think they're asking for more details on what exactly the boaters were doing with these inspections. So we, if I'm understanding this right, we had the boat, and basically the boaters were exposed to the same things that the inspectors were with these experimental inspection processes. So the boaters were not using their own boat to do these trials. They had our boat because we wanted to keep it standard across all 3 levels of participants. But so the boaters, they were inspecting, a boat that was maybe unfamiliar to them, and we do recognize that. So yeah, hopefully that kind of answers that. They were using the boat that we had for them to use.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question, a good economics question here. So noting that inspectors and decontaminators are also educators in a sense, they're providing education to the people that they're inspecting and decontaminating.
Mm-hmm.
So do funds spent on inspectors and decontaminators also help fund boater education? And is that factored for? I'll add in my own little piece to the question.
Yeah, this is a very big question that we grappled with for a really long time when developing methodologies for deciding how to deal with the economic aspects of this research. And I mean, the truth is, yeah, inspectors and decontaminators are a form of education. They're sitting there at the launch telling people about invasives, just like, a sign would be sitting there at the launch. I would say they're even better education forms than a sign at a launch, just because they're there, they're verbal, and they're, I guess, getting more attention than maybe a sign would be. For this study, we kept the educational efforts more so focused on signs and those types of things. And while inspectors and decontaminators do contribute to education, we said that their efforts were strictly on the inspection and decontamination side with the economic aspects of it. I would love to hear how we could try to change that. We grappled with it for a long time, but if you have any ideas, let me know. I'm happy to listen and brainstorm, but it's a tough one for sure.
Great, thank you. Okay, next one, I'm getting to a practical question along the lines of spiny water flea and viability. Do you happen to know how long they can survive out of water, both for the adults and potentially the resting eggs as well?
Yeah, so I don't remember the exact numbers. I know that the temperature needed to kill spiny water fleas is less than what's needed to kill zebra mussels. And I know that spiny water flea do desiccate pretty readily, I think, as they're being transported, if they're on fishing line and their fishing line is still sitting on your boat and you're moving from a different lake to another lake, I would anticipate they would dry out. The issue is when, you have, say, downrigging equipment or nets or ropes that you've pulled through the water and you now have coiled up in the boat and is sitting there soaking wet, and likely not drying out on a boat or on a overland transport. And that's where spiny water flea are likely to not desiccate, stay alive, and then when you go and put that downrigging equipment in the next lake, that's a huge risk there. So likely not so much if a spiny water flea is stuck on a fishing line and it's like a single spiny water flea, it's likely to desiccate when it's being transported over the road. However, with other equipment, nets, ropes, all sorts of things that stay wet, that's where the issue really lies.
Great, thanks, Nichole. I'll put a plug in too. We also have a webinar about spiny water flea and angling equipment. And I can find the link and drop it into chat, but this question may have been answered there as well. But if spiny water flea was of particular interest, we have a webinar for you. Okay, I'll move us on to the next one. I'm wondering specifically about if there's decontamination recommendations for wake boats with ballast tanks.
Yeah, I know there is. I haven't specifically looked at it, but I know that wake ballast tanks are a hard one because hot water can do a lot of damage to equipment, and a lot of folks don't really want damage to their boats and that sort of things. I don't know the exact temperature. I have to look it up in the decontamination protocol. I'm sure someone else on the line could answer this question, but yeah, I'm not sure. There definitely are decontamination equipment or decontamination protocols that are developed for wakeboard boats. I'm sure that the UMPS protocol probably states it somewhere as well. So I would need to do a little more research to understand those exact, sorry, I'm blurring out here. I would need to do more research to understand those exact temperatures and durations for wakeboard and ballast tanks.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, next question is about which units being used. So the wonder is what decontamination unit is used by the state? Is it the Land 7000?
Mm-hmm. So most of the decontamination, the mobile units were Landa units. There was a few that were, there was two that were used that were Hydrotech wash skids. And we did see variation or sinuation in temperature for both of those different types of mobile units. The only one that really stayed up to temp was that stationary hot water boiler system. Good question.
Okay. Next question, wondering about some ways that we can maybe use some of what you learned. So it looks like the National Park Service is planning to implement a large prevention, education, and outreach effort throughout the St. Croix watershed. And they're wondering if there's any educational resources or methods or materials from your study that might be available for use.
I mean, I'm sure there could be. It'd be great if I could develop them if I didn't have a full-time job now. But I will say that all of this data from this research is publicly available on the University of Minnesota's data repository. And you just like look up the title of my I guess I didn't say the title of the manuscript that's coming out soon. It's in review right now, but all of this data is going to be publicly available. everything besides the thermal imagery videos, because they just have identifying information because they have videos of people. But everything else is definitely going to be publicly available. You can do what you want with it and maybe make some really cool education things. I would love to see them for sure.
Right. Thanks, Nichole. Okay, next question was wondering a question about AIS Explorer and if the default for boater in AIS Explorer is based on the average of outstate and Twin Cities boaters together, so the 56%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the default is that 56% for boaters. So we did use the default is the average for all boaters in the state of Minnesota. So we didn't, the AIS Explorer doesn't have the, well, I guess it could have the capacity to separate it by region. It would just involve some more coding on the back end, but as of now, it's the average of the effectiveness of all boaters in the state. So it is that 56% as the default effectiveness. But like I said, it's really user friendly. You can go in and change it. And the data for split up by outstate and metro, so the effectiveness of metro and outstate boaters will be publicly available. Well, it is on the drum data repository, but it will also be in the manuscript that's coming out. So you could potentially go in, take that value from the manuscript and put it into the AIS Explorer if you wanted to change it, if you were, say, in the outstate or in the metro area. So yeah, right now it's just the average of all the boaters in Minnesota.
Great. Okay. Another question was, were the decontaminators starting on the starboard stern underside of the hull, or did the starting location as they worked their way around the boat vary?
It was extremely variable. I'm just pulling up, I know I had a metric to talk about this. Okay, yeah, there's so it was extremely variable. To answer your question, blankly, they didn't really start all similarly at the same part of the boat. Some started on the stern or on the port, starboard, back, all different variation. And the protocols for a full decontamination call for like a hot water rinse, a high pressure there are hot water soak, a high pressure rinse, and then why am I blinking on the final step? But anyways, the steps that are needed for a full decontamination were completed by 5 out of the 21 decontaminators that we had, or the 23 decontaminators that we had collected information from. So there was a lot of variability in the way decontaminators did those steps. So some did, a high pressure rinse with hot water at the same time. Some people did only a hot water soak and no high pressure rinse. So there was some variability in the steps that were taken by decontaminators. That's a good question. And the manuscript talks a lot about that. So be sure to look for that when it comes out for sure.
All right. Thanks, Nichole. I think we probably have time for one last question. I see there's one more that just rose up to the top in the voting. So did you consider do-it-yourself decontamination stations?
Like the CD3 stations and all of those. No, we did not. I think it would be really interesting to see the effectiveness of those. I know there is some research looking at the effectiveness of CD3 stations and self-serve stations. But I think that could be a great next step. You could just take these methods and apply them to that new type of prevention. You can do this for all sorts of preventions, canine AIS detection. The methods are pretty translational. But no, we did not account for those self-service stations.
That's great. Always opportunities for new
Absolutely.
questions to answer. So that leaves us 1 minute, and I'm going to take up the 1 minute to do some closing housekeeping. So I'm going to share screen one more time. Here it comes. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Nichole, for coming and sharing. This has been just a wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone who joined us today to hear all Nichole had to say. We're really glad to have you back and to be back to hosting these webinars. We do hope to have the next one, a topic out soon. We're targeting January, so watch for the next one. Webinars should be coming out on about an every other month schedule moving forward. I did mention that we're recording, so this will be available on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to head there now and see webinars from the past, you can go to z.umn.edu/AIStube. And you'll all get an email notification when this webinar is ready in case there's anything you'd like to go back and review or share with friends and colleagues. It will be there. Finally, I will take a note to watch for our survey. I think a little pop-up is going to come up when you close, and you'll probably also get an email. We really appreciate your feedback on these webinars and other topics you're interested in, how things are going, ways we can improve. So be sure to complete that survey. And then finally, if you'd like to reach out to Nichole, I do have her email showing on the screen now. And if you would like to reach out to us as the host of this webinar series, you can reach us at aisdetectors@umn.edu. And that's all that I have for us today. So thanks again, Nichole. We appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who joined. Hope you got something out of it, and I appreciate you all.